We have this next panel slated until about 11:45, and we might pick up a few minutes there on the back end if we have some great audience questions, as I anticipate. But we're going to structure this one a little differently. Gentlemen, just so you know, we're going to give each of you about 2 minutes just for some opening remarks, just to kind of set the tone. The overall theme of this panel is going to be legislative fixes to keep Maryland competitive. So, Senator Townsend, if you've got the best legislative fixes to keep Maryland competitive, we might be in trouble. But as you see here, we have 3 panelists, and I'm going to introduce them all to you just to sort of set the stage. First, to my left is our Senate President here in Maryland, Mr. Bill Ferguson. He represents District 46, which is entirely located in Baltimore City. It includes neighborhoods in South Baltimore, downtown, near and around the Inner Harbor, and Southeast Baltimore. There's a great bio in here on the senator. If you're interested in learning more about his background and how he made his way up here, please read that at your leisure. We also have Delegate Wayne Hartman to his left. Delegate Hartman represents District 38C, which is Wacomico and Worcester County. And then we have at the end of the table our senator from Delaware. He's the Senate Majority Leader, Bryan Townsend, and he represents District 11, which is Newark?
South Newark. Yeah.
South Newark. Okay, I want to make sure I had that one right. So we're going to give each of these gentlemen 2 minutes. I will start a little bit of a timer. I don't have a shepherd's hook, so I might cough. I'm not good at interrupting. I don't want to do that to you. But without further ado, Senate President Ferguson, why don't you go ahead and open us up?
Excellent. Well, good morning-ish. Good afternoon, everyone. It is truly a pleasure to be here with such an esteemed panel as well. And we were just saying, Zach, and the last time that we had a chance to get together was when we were visiting Wallops Island to see the spaceport, which from what I represent, which is the vast majority of the Port of Baltimore, to the spaceport, the amazing similarities of what it looks like to have public infrastructure be able to underpin and undergird private industry and facilitate commerce here in the state of Maryland. It's these sort of big infrastructure projects and areas that really are where the public sector and private sector, I think, are the most successful, where the public sector can build the base and the private sector can build wealth. And so that is the perspective I bring to this work. In 2 minutes, what does the world look like? I think we'll have a lot of time to jump into the specifics. I will say we are living in a very, very interesting point in time in history. And I say that in the context, I mean, obviously everyone, we can get into the political dynamics at the federal level, but if you take a step back sort of in this post-COVID period, 2 years sort of after the height of the pandemic, and you look around the globe and take it Russia, Ukraine, Taiwan, China, now even more recently in the last 3 weeks to the breakdown of the French government and the call of no confidence in the French government. You see that happening in Germany. South Korea, there is a coup. There are really odd forces impacting society right now. And I think that is a context that has to be recognized as we go into this legislative session and as we, as people who are involved and engaged on the Eastern Shore and in the state of Maryland, in this region, about how do we create stability in the midst of a great time of uncertainty.
Thank you. Thank you, Senate President. And Delegate Hartman, 2 minutes, my friend.
Well, thank you. It's I don't know how I found myself in between two such esteemed folks here. When I was invited, I thought I was here to listen. I wanted to hear what Senator Ferguson had to say. So when I saw my seat up here, I was kind of surprised. But I think it's well said. Expect the unexpected is how we have to look at things. We're always adapting and changing. And here I am. As a Republican representing this area, which I love, in Annapolis, which is, very, the politics are very one-sided, but yeah, we still find a way to work together. And I got to say, you're certainly a breath of fresh air there. It's, hard to find balance. And, Senate President Ferguson understands it and gets it, and we can get things done. But, at the same time, those who are coming in the General Assembly in Maryland, you have to deal with the folks that have these higher demands of, taxing and different concepts. But, we always seem to find a way to come together and make things work. And, obviously we have a lot of work to do. So it'll certainly be an interesting session. And I think, everybody in the room, whatever your political, thoughts or, preferences are. We all have the same goal. It's just a different idea as how we're going to get there. And, I think, we're going to keep working together and make it happen. So I think there's some themes that have been kind of redundant as to what we're hearing today, and there's some things that we could do, and hopefully we'll be able to do that together. So.
And thank you, Delegate Hartman. You make a great point. Most of us have the same goals in mind,
Absolutely.
right? We just have a different vision of the path we take to get there. And our last panelist, you might feel out of place because of the name of the panel, but this is our Senate Majority Leader, Bryan Townsend in Delaware, and he had a little bit of a drive to get here. We appreciate you joining us. But it's not lost on us that Delaware is one of Maryland's largest competitors, right? We share a lot of the state's borders that comprise Delaware. The Atlantic Ocean has a bunch of it, but Maryland has the overwhelming majority. And so it's going to be interesting to hear your perspective, not only about what Maryland's doing, but also maybe how Delaware reacts to that. So without leading you any more, I'd like to give you 2 minutes to just say hello and introduce yourself.
Certainly, I appreciate y'all having me. It's nice to know that some people view Delaware as a competitor or a threat, I guess. We don't always... I grew up from Delaware, born and raised. I feel like a lot of us don't always feel that way. We kind of feel like we're small and maybe even ignored sometimes. Obviously, there's certain areas in which we excel or are known even worldwide, but in many ways, I think we kind of just focus on what we're doing and assume the world doesn't care about us too much. So it's nice to know that we're like at least a competitor. And both Delaware, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, maybe even Delaware, New Jersey, although we don't share the land border and we don't really like them very much and they don't like us much either. If we can have sort of shared prosperity, shared growth, shared successes, I think it benefits all of us, and very much, southern Delaware with regard to agriculture, among other things, northern Delaware with regard to pharmaceuticals and biotech, and southeastern PA. There are some overlaps. So there's some really good opportunities overall. I do think Delaware, not that Maryland's a huge state, but Delaware obviously even smaller. We can be nimble, we can be dynamic, we can be, and we aren't always that way, and if we're not, I think we're leaving things on the table, and we should always aim to maximize the opportunity that comes with being a small state and get everybody in the room, including your federal delegation, and try to make some things happen. So coming into 2025, I think there's opportunity to try to do an even better job than we've done. We do have some successes, I think, but we can do an even better job in certain areas, so hopefully we embrace that. But to the Senate President's point, we are living in interesting times. I appreciate going through some of the international examples of that, and obviously even more locally here, we just see a whole lot of people that are stretched and strained, even if they're working hard. If they don't always have the opportunity to succeed or just have basic stability and dignity, you start to have problems, and that's when we all have to take seriously. I happen to be in New York the past couple of days, engaging on the legal front with regard to Delaware's role in the world. And trying to hear from people about what things have been going on and what they think about it. And I was on the train on the way up there, or soon to be on the train on the way up there, when the news came down about United Health CEO being shot and killed. And I think trying to understand what that means from a business and economic perspective is a really, really important thing. We can't take for granted that everyone's doing well, even if high-level economic numbers indicate that things might be in an okay place. And I also will note that I do think in many instances we do agree on certain outcomes, and how to get there is different, but not everybody does agree on those outcomes, and we have to sort of figure out how to engage as a group collectively, and it's okay to sometimes disagree on outcomes too, but there are individuals, I think, or sort of movements that really, really don't agree with where the dramatic majority of people would say we should go. We've got to find a way to make sure that we're all at least working together, the dramatic majority, in a productive direction. So I think we can get there, but there's some tough times for sure.
Yeah, and thank you. And some of those sentiments you shared remind me of something we heard from a former panelist, the Economic Development Director from York, Pennsylvania, when he alluded to something pie in the sky, a radical initiative that we could take in terms of legislation and policy and priorities. He said focusing on quality of life has direct and indirect implications on business, right? And I think you just alluded to that as well, Senator Townsend. So we're going to jump into some of the questions that we have. These questions are prepared by our Government Relations Committee in addition to the Economic Forecast Committee. So a lot of folks had the chance to contribute to these. We had to whittle it down to 4 in the interest of time. So some of them are a little more broad, but that'll give you the opportunity to sort of craft your responses. So looking ahead to the next decade, what legislative changes do you believe will be most crucial for maintaining your state's competitive edge in an evolving business landscape, particularly regarding emerging industries and technologies? We're going to start with you, Senate President Ferguson.
Yeah, I mean, I would say before getting to the direct answer, I think the context of what the next year ahead, this is going to be an incredibly impactful session that's coming up from January for April for us here in Maryland. If you look at the context of a new administration, again, regardless of politics, take politics off the table, Maryland is extremely exposed to federal investments. If the federal government coughs, Maryland catches pneumonia. And so, we have about 11% of all W-2 employment wages come from the federal government. It's about an additional $45 billion in Maryland's GDP comes from federal contracts. When you start to look at things like NIH and investments for our major medical institutions that invest in research and development, things like APL, Applied Physics Lab, which is a massive economic driver. You look at the spaceport in Virginia. We are very, very, very reliant on federal dollars. It accounts for roughly 10 to 12% of all of Maryland's GDP comes from the federal government in some capacity. So in the world where there is the Department of Government Efficiency is really looking to cut 50% of the federal budget, whether or not that's viable or not, it is likely a momentum, it creates a momentum. It's something that will have a big impact on Maryland. And so we have to be able to account for that. And when we think about where we are most successful, where we have derived the vast majority of our growth over the last 15, 20, 30 years, it is from the spin-off of research and development facilities that rely on federal dollars for that research and development. And so our universities are one of the best, we have one of the best university systems in the country. It has been a driver of our economic prosperity in many, many ways, but it is exposed to a lot of risk depending on where the world goes in the time ahead. We also have the Port of Baltimore, which is very reliant on international trade. And so if tariffs are going to be a part of the future in big ways, and there's a trade war of tariff impact, that will have a short-term dramatic impact on a lot of our economic productivity for the Baltimore region that expands to the Eastern Shore and Western Maryland. And so, these are the things that we have to be able to account for. We don't exactly know what they look like, but and I think by March we'll have a better sense. But I think dealing with the state budget and where we make our investments, how we balance our state budget, which we will constitutionally do, is going to lead the trajectory in very different ways. Do I have more time or now shake?
Yeah, I mean,
Should I hold it?
No, just wrap it up here shortly. And
Okay, I would just say the other aspect here is we are already dealing with a bit of a challenge economically with our deficit that exists today. And a lot of it has been sort of forecasted on education things that we've done with the blueprint or the Kirwan Commission, which has led for the blueprint for Maryland's future. The challenge here is that those costs associated with increased investments in education, which I strongly believe in, are not immediate costs. They're not our current cause of the problem. The deficit that we're facing as we go into session this year is largely based on entitlements. It's based on increased Medicaid spending and increased child care subsidy spending. Why is that the case? Well, if you look at the population that is utilizing these services, one, they're sicker and they're utilizing more expensive services. Delayed care for many years, delayed the cost of people are coming in when they come post-COVID are coming in. They are more sick and they are more costly. When we look at COVID's impact on child care, huge impact, huge expanse in the number of people that are using the child care subsidy to get high quality child care for their kids to go to work. That has a cost. And so about nearly $1 billion of the deficit are those entitlement spending components that have nothing to do with education. That means we have some hard choices this upcoming year to decide, do we restrict child care access and reduce that subsidy for people able to send their kids to high quality child care? Do we reduce health care services for people that are sick? These are going to be the big questions that we're faced with that we have to make a decision about what are our key values as we look to invest in core and important technologies moving forward.
Thank you. And it's not, we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that a lot of the decisions you guys have to make are challenging. But it is refreshing to know that we're being honest and we can be transparent about what some of those hurdles may be. Delegate Hartman, looking out 10 years into the future, what do you think the legislative changes that are going to be crucial for maintaining the state's competitive edge are going to be?
Sure, I think we have a tough session ahead of us and a tough 10 years. As Senate President Ferguson mentioned, the new administration, we are very dependent on the federal government. And I think with the new administration and knowing what could happen, I mean, there's talk of maybe dismantling some of Washington, D.C. and so forth. So if we lose some of those jobs, if the Department of Ag goes out to Iowa or whatever, and we lose some of those jobs here, I think it even makes it more important that we do have the right legislation and so forth moving forward to make us more competitive. I think we have to, be more focused on job creation. Right now, we do a whole lot of things, but we don't do anything, that's just world-class, stellar. With, tourism, we spend $10 or $12 million a year compared to some of the other states spending, 2 and 3 times that. We put money in, or not money, but we've created legislation for data centers. We exempted the sales tax on equipment because the equipment's so expensive. And then later we went and because of their need to have, reliable utility source, we allowed diesel generators. But data centers, aside from, the expensive equipment and the need for the diesel generators, and, that helped get them around our building standards, our utility costs are so high. We need to look at our energy policy. Is it time to think nuclear? I mean, it's the conversations being had all over the world. Is it something that we should be considering here? And I think so. There's technology that's changing in it. It's not 3 Mile Island anymore. It's different. So I really think we need to be focused and pick something, if it is biotech. Right now it's working in Montgomery County, but it's not working in the whole state. So we need to pick an area, I think, and really focus on it. Another thing is our corporate tax structure. How easy is it, or how viable are we to attract new businesses? We have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the area. I've put legislation in for the past several years trying to lower it and be more competitive. We're at 8.25%. 10 years ago, the Augustine Commission, number one recommendation from the Augustine Commission, lower the corporate tax rate. You know what we did with that? We spend all this money on these, commissions and studies, and we get the answer, but we don't like what the answer says, we don't do anything. But, we haven't touched that in 10 years. So, I think that we really need to start paying attention to some of these. It's going to have a price in the beginning, but it's going to pay off. And we don't need to lower it. Pennsylvania's going to be at 4.99 by 2031. If we take 0.25% off a year and show people that we're moving in the right direction, pass something that says 0.25% a year for the next 10 years, at least it's moving us in the right direction. I think the way we're spending money, President Ferguson mentioned, our increase in Medicaid service and so forth. I think some of that, is true because of COVID, but also some of our other policy. Our immigration policy is such, and, I mean, people here who know me locally know that at one time I was probably the largest provider of student housing for international students that worked in Ocean City. I helped some of those students get legal status here. I'm not against it, you know what I'm saying? But there's a process, and with some of those folks that, we're welcoming into the state come with some of those higher, cost of health care and so forth. And I think also some of our other policy is chasing out some of the more affluent that don't have the higher health care that's associated with some of our other population. And we know from the comptroller's report, we are losing population, and it's been more prevalent in the last couple of years. Because from our other policies, some people can't afford to die in Maryland. We're number 50 in the country. We're the only one with an inheritance tax and an estate tax. So it's, it makes people decide to move away at some point. So, there are things that we can do. Some of the things we've done legislatively in the last couple of years, I think we need to fix. After every action has a reaction, as we see some of those reactions. Juvenile crime, crime is a big cost for businesses. There's some businesses that, are more impacted than others. I just recently talked to a business owner, and they can't even display, dirt bikes or something. Somebody will, break through the window, come crashing through to steal the dirt bikes. I mean, I'm looking out here seeing Cindy Fitzgerald. I think of, some of our policy on electric vehicles. We skipped the hybrid. We went right to electric, and we're getting pushback from people. They don't want it. It doesn't work here. People need to understand rural living, and the electric vehicles aren't always the answer. So I think some of the policy, especially some of the energy policy, we need to roll back. And I think I'm being told I need to stop talking.
No. Well,
It's hard to stop me on stuff.
Listen, I think this is we want this to be a free-flowing conversation, and so we will have a timekeeper who's helping to kind of keep us on schedule. But Senator Townsend, as you look out into the future, right? And we can't predict it, but we can try to assume trends are telling us what may happen. What are you thinking about in the state of Delaware to maintain that competitive edge? I know you don't feel like you're a threat to some of us, but we recognize that there are some advantages to business in Delaware.
Well, anyone someone tells you they're not a threat to you, you probably can rest assured they're a threat to you.
Yeah.
So just trying to be kind and congenial about it. Wouldn't also mind just sitting here like listening to the legislators from Maryland, kind of just nod my head and say, "Oh, both sound interesting." Okay, next question. But to the extent Delaware's perspective on this might be helpful, I think that occasionally you have inflection points, whether it's like a massive effort at the federal level for onshoring, and so you might have like a real inflection point in the moment, versus sort of the daily grind of the state level. You want to be ready to make use of unique opportunities as they come, but you also need to focus on the basics too. And I think that so we can talk about whether there have been recently and will continue to be kind of inflection points you need to make use of. That's an important thing I think that should drive analysis and governance. Even if it's not like an inflection point, sometimes you just have like people make commitments. Like certain parts of northern Delaware right now have a whole lot of warehousing going up. And that's great in certain ways, I guess, for construction, and it might be great in certain ways for distribution if it all works out. It's, there's plenty of instances of people building them before they even have signed, clients yet. And I trust, okay, you've run your numbers, you got your, you priced the risk, you're good to go. But that land now is committed to that for some reliable period of time. But sometimes you can't sit around and wait for some magical thing to kind of fall out of the air. So it's a balance, I think, overall. But I do think that generally speaking, over the next 10 years, some things we've identified that we really need to work on from a workforce perspective. Certainly housing is, I know, an issue everywhere in the country. I know in Sussex in particular, driven by tourism, you have a really important need of a service economy to serve that sector, but those individuals, can't afford the price of housing relative to what the land value is, especially with so many people trying to move into Delaware from out of state. But you have a real pressure there, and it's not just like sort of young people working in the tourism industry. You've got even like basic healthcare workers that we desperately need for an aging population in Sussex can't afford that housing. So I'm already getting the 15 seconds. I will abide. The dude will abide. But I think that housing is a key issue. Other kinds of workforce, some criminal justice reform to make sure that people have second chances meaningfully in an economy that needs those workers is something else we're taking a long look at. But yeah, some targeted economic development should always be on the table. You should always be out there to figure out what you can do to really incentivize someone coming in. Beyond the targeted, though, you got to have both an environmental agency and a transportation agency that's working hand in hand to try and make sure that when opportunities present themselves, which you should never take for granted, that you're ready to move quickly and make the right decisions for the public, but ones that have the win-wins that are possible. If you're willing to roll up the sleeve, take some heat perhaps politically for being the one to make the decision and move forward on a path to success. And by the way, whether you're an elected official or an appointed official or a bureaucrat, if you don't want the heat, then please let someone else step in who wants it, because that's what we have to get these things right on the right time frame.
Yeah, and you shared something that I think resonates with all of us, not just as elected officials, but it's the constant reminder that in order to effectively look forward and do it safely, right? Just like when you're driving down the road, you have one windshield, but you have 3 mirrors that help you look behind you. So those reflection points and those inflection points to respond to what you're seeing, right? Whether it's unintended consequences or whatever it may be, is very important. It's very critical, not just as a lawmaker, but as a business owner, right? And as an employee, you have to understand what you did that brought you there, and sometimes you have to revisit that. So great points all around. This is a Delaware question, so I'm going to tee it right back up to you. But beyond tax policy, what legislative tools has Delaware successfully employed to attract and retain businesses that our friends in Maryland might consider adopting?
Oh, I'm not going to speak to friends in Maryland and what you all are thinking about us. I guess I'd say that I don't know if I don't know if you would say there's anything that you feel Delaware's done in that kind of way, quite honestly. I know that I think you guys are ahead of us on healthcare with trying to have more sustainable healthcare costs, and that affects not only provision of healthcare and people's experiences as consumers of healthcare and patients, but also businesses. Delaware's quite a bit behind, and we're currently still fighting out a pretty bruising political battle with regard to trying to get our hospital systems to have more sustainable healthcare costs, especially since we have nowhere near the top. Like we're top 5, top 10 in the country annually on costs. We're like half or bottom half on results, and you can't. That's not sustainable. You guys are, I think, are ahead of us in a lot of ways on that front. And education too. Right now, we're trying to catch up quickly on educators' salaries, mainly because Maryland, which shares that nice long border you talked about earlier, you guys are ahead of us by several years in terms of educators' salaries. So we're kind of catching up to you on some of these basics that are governmental, then maybe not directly economic development, but set the ecosystem in place for them, as the Senate President had talked about earlier. I think these are build base and then have the private sector build wealth, or however more clever than that you'd put it. And I think that that Delaware's a little bit behind on education and on healthcare in this way. So I don't know if there is sort of an economic development strategy we've employed that you all envy. I certainly think that we're closer to the southeast Pennsylvania area overall, so some of the biotech spillovers there. We have a long history of biotech in Delaware, so kind of building off that base is different than having like a genius idea to capture something. The legal industry, obviously, in Delaware for 100 plus years since Jersey fumbled the ball, is something that we already have. Again, not genius idea per se relative to Maryland, but we got to tend to that, and there's been some recent decisions from the court, both substance of the decisions as well as tone of the decisions from the Court of Chancery that I know in New York and in California, other places are saying, wait a minute, Delaware, what's going on there? Should we be looking at Texas or Nevada to reincorporate? Elon Musk is a whole different story. You can't make him happy about anything, but overall there are trends there we need to be keeping an eye on. So between that, our shared ag sector, I mean, I don't think there's any genius thing necessarily, but if there is a genius thing, I welcome my colleagues here on the panel to tell me what it is, but promise that you won't take it.
Well, conversely, my counter to that, and I'm going to let you share what those genius things are, but the way I was going to frame the question for our Maryland counterparts was, what unique advantages does Maryland currently have within their legislative framework that we need to preserve and or enhance? So what are we doing to help keep us competitive, and what do we need to do to keep it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go a little bit. I'll start on the positive end. I would say if you look at the housing construction boom that's happening in Delaware, and compare that to Maryland, that is one of our biggest challenges. We are struggling with affordability when it comes to housing because it is very, very challenging to build. And there's only really one way to deal with housing costs. It's either you have more supply generally, or you find ways to expand the supply that you have by putting more on the same site. And so, I mean, you can lower costs, but it's very difficult. You can pay for people to subsidize rents. That's not a sustainable solution. You got to build more to lower costs. Delaware's doing that, and I don't know if it's one specific policy, but I think there has been a massive growth in Delaware from a housing policy that we've been trying to figure out how to replicate here. Maryland has never been a state that's like a big boom or a big drop. We're a very middle temperament state. And that is great when things are down low because we tend to be we don't go as low as everyone else, but it doesn't feel as great when things are going and booming because we're sort of in the middle temperament generally. I think that has actually been a benefit for us because it keeps us very stable. We've benefited from having a AAA bond rating. I will say one of the things that we have to be very mindful of is costs for Marylanders overall. It's okay to have higher costs, but you have to have a higher product. People buy an iPhone for 2x what they will buy an Android because they believe that it is a better product. But if you have high costs and not a great product, that's not a good business model. And so I think that's really where we are going to have to face and have a tough conversations this year. There are lots of places where I believe we probably could be more competitive when it comes to costs. The question is, what do you cut to get there? And that's the challenge that's ahead. And the real answer is growth. If we can find ways to grow faster than than costs are increasing, then that will be the net win for Marylanders overall. That's what we're trying to find a way to set up this upcoming session. It's going to be hard, and I don't think it's an immediate solution. But these moments of consequence really do matter, and I think it gives us a chance to really redefine what are we going to place our bets on. What are we going to say we're really going to do? And then what are we going to say we're not going to do? Which we can't be everything to everybody.
Thank you, Senate President. And Delegate Hartman, what do you think Maryland does well, and what do you want to make sure that we're preserving about those things we do well, or how are we doubling down on them?
Well, it's kind of nice to go last because I could, comment on some of the things that are said and going off track a little bit. Hearing about how, with being on the border with Maryland and teacher salary and so forth impacts you. there's so many times in Annapolis, the rural counties, we talk about those borders and how close we are to other places. And Central Maryland sometimes forgets, when legislation and so forth is passed, it's great. It doesn't really, there's not many choices as people have in rural Maryland. The folks in Western Maryland can cross the line in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, and folks down here, we can cross the line in Delaware and Pennsylvania. And as a rural legislator, we're always reminding the other folks that, things are different here. So it's good to hear that you guys are dealing with the same thing and having those same conversations because, it doesn't work for everything, and there's competition. When we talk about tax policy and things like that, you got to remind them, wait a minute, if we do that, people cross the line into Delaware when we talked about different things. So it's good to hear. But, housing supply, you mentioned, and I want to comment, there are ways to build supply, and a lot of it is regulatory. So the other part of my life, I do a lot with construction and so forth, and being next to Delaware, you often hear about the difference in cost to build in Delaware versus Maryland. So I think a lot of it could come back to regulatory, and if we find ways where we can loosen some of the building regulation we have, and still provide safe and affordable housing, I think that's something we need to look at because housing is such a huge component of it. The trickle-down economy, if we start getting housing going, so many other things happen. And going back to the real question, federal government, I'm stealing my thunder from some other questions later, but federal government is such an important part of Maryland. And with this new administration, I really think we need to extend an olive branch and see how we can work with them. I was disappointed to hear, like the Attorney General's office, I understand that in anticipation of the administration, they're preparing, hiring more attorneys and so forth with money we don't have, and the Moore administration was hiring somebody to work in anticipation of the administration. And let's extend that olive branch and work with them because the federal government is one of our biggest partners. I mean, Delaware, what I talked about earlier, when you target one thing and do it right, Delaware has found that one thing, and it's the financial and insurance industry. And that's what they've targeted, and that's what they do right. And that's a perfect example of what I was talking about in the first question, how we got to look for that one niche or whatever it is we're going to be, throw all of our resources at that, and really make it work for the entire state. And Delaware has really mastered that. Their housing, and this is something interesting that I just learned, and you can help me to understand if it's true or not. Their housing boom, a lot of the infrastructure right now, their water and sewer is coming from a private company. So it's not a government expense, it's a private company that's providing a lot of the water and sewer infrastructure that's helping to fuel that. So, if that's the case, that's something that we need to look at here and maybe embrace that, if not at a state level, at a county level.
Yeah, thank you, Delegate. Just because we want to keep on time, we did start this panel about 10 minutes late. Just we had some technical difficulties, wanted to get the stage reset. So we're gonna go until about 11:55. We've got about 15 more minutes. I want to get through these two questions, and then we're gonna make up that time in your lunch. So everybody's gonna have to eat a little quicker. So the Trump tax cuts, right? We're talking about federal stuff. So and this is an economic forecast. So we're gonna have to talk economic principles and policies a little bit. So the Trump tax cuts in 2016 cut income taxes, including the corporate tax rate on the federal side, yet revenue to the Treasury more than doubled. So do you believe that supply side economics work the same way at the state level? And if so, why or why not? And we'll start again with you, Senate President.
In anticipation of this question, I went to try and find the exact sort of citation where where revenues actually double over the 4-year period. I couldn't find it to show that it was a doubling of revenue. It looked like if you count it per capita and per GDP, there was actually a flat or decline. There was a one-time bump with the cut in capital gains. I think there were a lot of realized gains that were experienced that had been held up in anticipation for a tax cut that allowed for the recognizing of that income. But what we do know is that the debt skyrocketed as well, and so at the federal level, it's easy to do this because you don't have to balance the budget, and so that's not the same with the state. The federal government, we can print more money and cover tax cuts through debt and sell it off to China, or we can, choose not to cut. Or at the state level, we don't have that luxury. We have to make the tough decisions to balance, and we also can't print money. So it's a bit of a different equation for us. I would say as we look forward for the upcoming year, the budget is going to drive the budget and tax policy are going to drive the entire session. It is going to be the underpinned narrative of everything that we do this upcoming year, and it'll set the stage for what the next 5 years look like. It's not going to be an easy conversation, but it's going to have to require significant adjustments and cuts and realignments to priorities, and it's probably going to have to deal with revenues in some capacity in a way that does not make us less competitive as a state and a region, or in the region. So that's going to be a challenging conversation, I think, for the upcoming 90 days. But it's really important because we have got to set ourselves up and make some choices about what type of state we're going to be in the new world order of likely less federal revenue available and the need to invest in the places where we can be more competitive. And I do want to this seems like slightly an aside, but as we think about things, I see that Senator Carrozza is here as well, who has been serving on our Apprenticeships Commission. So as we think about things like workforce and finding new ideas of ways for people to engage in the workforce in competitive industries, in healthcare, in bioscience, you name it, we've also got to think differently about how we're training and preparing people to be competitive. And things like apprenticeships and earn to learn and engaging businesses to help us figure out how do we have better workforce systems. These are the types of things that we're going to have to invest more in while we are probably pulling back in other areas. So this is a think different session, and it's going to require a lot of tough choices.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing some of the tools and the mechanisms that are in place that maybe the feds can use versus a state or even a regional or local government, because while that's inherently obvious to you guys working as elected officials, sometimes we forget, right? We think it's just a higher level, right? It's just in D.C. instead of at the state level. So those are great examples of the challenges that we're going to have as a state because we don't have access to those same tools or mechanisms. Delegate Hartman, what do you think?
Sure. Well, I'm going to kind of finish off part of the last question with this. This lends itself, I think, perfectly into how we were talking about housing. And, it's not necessarily, when we talk about our tax policy, there's also, I think, a component of that is coupled with regulation or deregulation. So we can spur the economy without really spending money. As I was saying with the housing, if we find a way to deregulate some of the overburdensome building, restrictions, I consider myself an environmentalist. I'm the delegate that was the sponsor of a bill to ban the release of balloons, and I'm not into regulation. I promised myself there'd be no regulation, but here this Republican from the Eastern Shore is the one passing, legislation to ban the release of balloons in the state of Maryland. So I'd consider myself an environmentalist. I care about the Bay, I care about the ocean, and but we have just such burdensome code when it comes to some of the environmental issues related to construction. Some of our policy getting down in the weeds, when we build homes today, we over-insulate the home with our energy code in Maryland, and then have to introduce fresh air so it's healthy, So you have cost of the equipment to introduce the fresh air, you have over cost of some of the insulation demands and so forth. So I think that we really need to look at finding ways to lower the cost of building. And then when you have all those trades employed, then you have the finished product, and then you have the realtors, the lawyers, the surveyors. Then you have the people moving in that's buying the furniture and all the other goods that come with it. And then when companies are looking at us as a state, the housing, our cost of living here is atrocious. So, you know what I mean? All those things blend together. It's not just, there's not one magic answer here that we can do. We have to do a lot of things to change things. I mean, if you look at Maryland, we're number 5 overall for economic performance ranking, number 43 in personal income tax, 39 in corporate income tax, 50 in the state inheritance tax, 44 state minimum wage, 44 in the cost of living, 44 in domestic migration, unfortunately moving out of Maryland. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do, and it's a culmination of those that are going to give us the end product. And as I said, we have some work to do, but we can definitely get there. Kind of like a slot machine. The more money you put in, you keep losing a little bit each time. That's the way that trickle-down economics works, like with housing. people keep spending that money. Every time it's spent, it's taxed in a different way, So it's, we need to create the business environment, and everything else will fall in place.
Thank you, Delegate. And Senate Majority Leader Townsend, what do you think? Supply side economics. I know you're an attorney.
Yeah.
But
well, I'm an attorney at the undergrad level. Economics was one of my majors, and I did an
there we go.
economics as well. So when I had this question come across, I was like, I don't remember supply side economics being exactly framed that way. I looked it up, and I was probably Googling at the exact same time Senate President was. I also couldn't find some of the sources that completely, agree with the framing of the question. But I guess, and I really appreciate the senator's point about what it's actually like to govern at the state level relative to the federal level. It's a key difference, no doubt. I guess what I'd say about it is there are definitely times when targeted tax efforts can make a big difference. And you got to figure those out and separate those from the times when you're just arguing about sort of like partisan or otherwise sort of politics divorced from reality, how it often unfolds. There definitely are times where it can be targeted in an effective way. Whether it's sort of permanent tax changes, temporary tax changes, or other kinds of economic incentive programs. And I do think it can be frustrating. I think whatever your political background is, I think you should try to be honest about what the likely effect of a measure will be. And there definitely can be times when, on the Democratic side, you might not want to do something that, you might take some heat, but it actually would make a difference. On the Republican side, you might want to stick to your talking points, but come on, it's not going to work. And I think trying to find the real difference is really key. And often, obviously, in our world, is not rewarded all that much. So there's no wonder why we don't always, make the progress we should make. But like, for example, I know in Delaware, fantastic mid-sized company, fantastic, amazing. They had hoped for, actually, they weren't even asking for economic incentives, but they reached out at one point and they're like, wait a minute, like, we've been here, we've started here, we've grown here, we're doing well here, and it seems like so much economic development activity is targeted, or economic from the government efforts are targeted to attract someone from out of state. Well, what about us who are here already? What can you do for us? And when they had a chance actually to grow in Delaware, they actually chose to, they didn't fully relocate, but they expanded across the line in PA. Heartbreaking. They're amazing. And so I just think we need to understand kind of the reality is, again, back to the idea of taking heat and making real decisions. A lot of times on these economic efforts, you're not 100% sure it's going to work out. I mean, come on, you're not 100% sure it's going to work out. To do your best. And I think part of it, when it comes to tax rates, part of it would be, well, if you were to create even like a dramatic incentive for activity that's not here yet, if it doesn't work, what have you really lost? And if it does work, how do you then phase it back into the portfolio in a more kind of like even way over time? And that could be just one kind of wild example off the cuff might be some like massive tax relief with regard to some kind of housing redevelopment. I mean, housing stock that needs to be redeveloped in certain areas, and why not try and really facilitate that through certain tax relief, that the alternative is nothing happens. So, but again, now you're in a partisan world where it's like, well, that doesn't sound like a very democratic thing to say, and okay, well, but here's how it might work, and obviously it's helpful if other jurisdictions have tried it and it's worked. But I just think overall, last answer, the panelists, I think it's really important to try and figure out when these efforts would make a real difference versus just kind of part of the political noise on one side or the other. It won't always be easy. Let's just do our best, and then take a deep breath, drink some coffee, and come back the next day and keep trying your best. Take a look at what actually worked or didn't work.
Yeah, not only when will they make a real difference, but also are those efforts so specifically focused on bringing in new that we're not doing a great job servicing what we already have existing and retaining.
Sure, and
right?
you have to do it to make the difference. When Amazon was shopping itself nationally for for the next great thing, that was just wild to watch happen. Like, really, we're all going to sit there and fight over the greatest economic incentive package for Amazon. Is that what's really going to make their decision? Because I know it makes small and medium and even large local businesses. It makes a difference for them. And that was really wild to see some of these states like fight against each other. I mean, would it have made the difference? I'm very convinced it wouldn't have. Easy for me to say, I guess. But I think when you know that there are local businesses that aren't growing as well as they could, or they're choosing other jurisdictions because you're not tending to them well enough, then you have an actual problem that you should be addressing.
No, thank you. And I know we've got one last question that we had shared with the group, and I'm going to ask you guys to list your top 3 priorities, right? Which means we're already racing the clock. So Carrie, our timekeeper, is going to keep us straight, but we want to try to wrap this up in maybe a minute and a half, no more than 2 minutes each. So please share the top 3 challenges your state faces when it comes to maintaining a strong competitive business climate, or ramping up policies that accelerate your state's competitiveness. So top three, Senate President.
Yeah,
what do you
easy.
think?
I mean, we'll be balancing the budget in a way that protects our priorities and keeps us competitive. That will be the driving narrative and focus this year. The second will be looking at energy policy generally and the costs of energy in the state of Maryland. We have lots of interesting dynamics at play, one of which is totally unrelated to any public policy we made, but a private settlement to shut down coal plants in the state of Maryland. The shutdown of those 2 plants is good for the environment, without a doubt, but is really terrible for our energy supply. And so we have some real questions around energy generation that are causing real and unacceptable cost increases for energy in the state of Maryland that we have to figure out some policies this year. And then the third is kind of continuing to be able to invest in our human infrastructure and make it attractive and viable for Marylanders to thrive here. That means making sure that they can raise a family here, they can send their kid to a good school, they can live in a house that isn't 50% of their income, that they can use a transportation system that doesn't require huge congestion, or that they have access to public transit when it's viable. So the human condition here in Maryland underpins everything. We're as good as our people, and so we have to make sure that we're investing in our human capacity as we are looking to make costs more tangible and acceptable here in Maryland.
Thank you, Senate President. Delegate Hartman.
I think I'm going to die on the sword of the corporate tax. We have to reduce that. So I won't give up on that. And I do think one of the things we really have to work on is the cost of living, the whole electric, the challenges with the electric grid. We're eliminating fossil fuels and so forth, and then getting power from the grid where sometimes it's created by, what we're eliminating. So, we're creating challenges for our folks. Climate Solutions Act of 2022, I think, is something we really need to take a hard look at, pushing back, and some of the demands brought by that to electrify buildings. Right here on campus, the university just remodeled a building, and in front of Holloway Hall, I'm kind of disoriented as to where I am right now, but Holloway Hall, in the front of it, they have a $20 million field of, I think it was roughly $20 million field of geothermal wells, put in. There's a huge cost with that, and we do things so quickly. Let's move things at a smaller pace. When you're asking for an existing hotel, again, back to the fact that I am an environmentalist. I am concerned about our environment. Moving forward, building hotels, it makes sense to require electric. The technology's there now, but to take a 17-story hotel that has mechanical equipment in it, the size of a bus, maybe a couple of them, and expect them to take that equipment out that's working fine and replace it with something that's going to be electric, that's an overdue burden on the business. And what do we create? How much greenhouse gas are we creating by having all those vehicles and trucks and everything else, performing that task? Whereas if we left it in place through its useful life, it may make more sense. Kerwin, I think we need to take a look. A lot of the principles in Kerwin I embrace. My daughter's a teacher, but we've done it so quick. Putting everything together at one time with such a huge price tag, and our deficit right now is what, 2.7 billion. It cost at Kerwin is $4 billion. So we're in good shape economically. It's just some of the price tags on things that we've implemented. So maybe we can slow some of that down and take a look at what we're doing there and move it in smaller steps. So I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
No, and look, there is definitely a light at the end of the tunnel. That's why we all come to listen not only to the challenges, but the opportunities to get better. So, Senator Townsend, I'm going to let you take us home.
Sure,
sir.
thanks, Zach. I think you said 3, I'll do 4, but I'll do them real quick. I mean,
Yeah.
health, housing, education, and I'll call it permitting. On the health, again, Delaware is one of the most expensive in the country on a per unit basis, with results nowhere near the top. And that's a big problem, not only for the actual health and wellness of our people, which include health and wellness of the workforce that businesses depend on, but also from a business perspective, the costs are pretty astronomical. So we've got to get those under control. And you see a little bit of fighting going on because, the hospitals are pretty big members of the chamber in Delaware. And so you got them saying no, you got other members of the chamber saying, please, we need help. And I love it when I get business leaders come to me quietly saying, well, I can't fight my other business leaders, so can you please fight for them? I'm just like, great, I'll be that guy, I guess. But it's a
I know
real-
that feeling very well.
Yeah, you know, it's fun. But that's a very serious policy issue. Housing, again, I think the Senate President talked about how, or actually maybe it was Delegate, who talked about growth in housing. That may be true, but if it's only a growth in sort of the more sort of expensive housing in the Sussex tourism area, that's not quite addressing the overall portfolio we need to. So housing up and down the state of Delaware, we got to do a better job of trying to make sure we're filling out the portfolio in an effective way. Education perspective, again, pressure is partly from Maryland. God bless you. I'm not faulting you for it. It's good. Educators deserve to be paid like the kings and queens they are in our society for what they're doing, and they're nowhere near paid that much, even in Maryland, and Delaware's trying to catch up. But overall in Delaware, we just for 20, 30 years now, we kind of have had an education system that allows all kinds of various segregation for various reasons, but yet still in many ways compares the schools as if they're on par, and they're not. And so we need to do a better job of being honest about what schools do and what students need what resources to make it effective across the spectrum of people's abilities and the roles they're going to play moving into the future, especially when it's such a major part of the state budget. And then from a permitting perspective, on top of all of that, I think at the end of the day, business is driven so much by certainty. You tell someone 2 years or 5 years in a project, they'll be able to make it work. On the way here, actually, I talked to a business leader in Delaware who called me and asked about whether there are capital incentives in Delaware to help fund early childhood education centers. Because if you just give like a 20-year loan at 2.5% interest rate, they can make it work. Imagine that in a place where there aren't enough spots for kids. So let's take a look at that. And so I think, anyway, that's a one example, but from a permitting perspective, businesses just want the certainty, right? Give it to them straight, be reliable, have that certainty. And so I think, again, environmentally or transportation-wise, whatever it is in the state government, we should be bending over backwards to provide certainty to people so they can make their decisions, and that Delaware, and perhaps our friends in Maryland as well, because we're all part of the same team, will be known as a region that, hey, you can come here, you can get this done pretty reliably, pretty quickly, and move on with the kind of broader benefits that brings to everybody in the community. So I'd say health, housing, education, and permitting are really teed up to try and make us a better, more competitive place.
Yeah, and you know, representative of the business community, when we talk about certainty, I think you're absolutely right. That's all we're looking for, right? If this is the mark we have to hit, and we hit that mark, then that should be acceptable. So thank you to our panel. Let's give them a big round of applause. We have one more speaker before lunch, and I apologize, we are a little behind, but that's my fault. So we're going to go ahead and prepare immediately for our keynote speaker. Do not get up and go anywhere. I promise you, you're going to want to hear this next presentation. It's really exciting, and it's going to be really, really cool.